Welcome to Module AP, where P stands for Production Constraints. The point of this module is to relate the production constraints that we have put in Module P. So if we look what we did as a reminder in Module P, we set out for each of the different production constraints and the crops, how much area was under each production constraint. What we are now doing in Module AP is assessing for each of these adaptations in relation to the production constraints, what happens in 5 scenarios. The non-impacted areas, the mild, moderate, heavy, and very heavily impacted areas. And there's 2 components of that. There's the yield component and the economics component. So for each of these 5 scenarios, we're asking 4 questions. The first one is, what is the yield if you don't do the adaptation? So in the first case, if we were not to use the variety BT40 and the land was not impacted by unbalanced fertilizer use, what would be the yield with the adaptation and the yield without the adaptation, without and with? So essentially what we're getting is a yield response against the production constraint for that adaptation. So we ask that for in each of the types of land impacted by the discussed production constraint. The other components then are the third component, which is the annual change in the cost of production. What we want to capture here is that often you will have that annual change, and it can be more or it can be less. So in the case of a variety, for instance, the normal system of not using that BT40 variety might be recycled seed, so there would be 0 cost for that seed. But if you were to use BT40, you have to pay a certain amount per kilo for seed. So that's an increase in cost. There may be other circumstances where it's a decrease, like if you move from 3 tillage events to 1 tillage event, the cost of production changes, it's reduced. You're reducing by 2 tillage events and whatever the value of each tillage event is, and you would put that as a negative. And you will see it will turn green if it's good, if it's less, and it will be red if it costs more. So you can see examples of green and red here. The final element that we ask is around other income changes. So this one is a little bit more complex. The things to remember are, we are not talking about yield or the value of yield improvement because we capture that over here. And we're not talking about the change in cost of production. What we're talking about here is other non-yield related income. So the key thing that we need to capture here are things like if it is diversification, let's say it's intercropping, you will get a change in yield of the primary crop, and that crop will be whatever we're talking about. You'll get a change in production, but you also get that secondary crop income. So you might have to do a little math. You might say, if we intercrop with pigeon pea, and that pigeon pea we get 1 ton per hectare, and that's worth $500 per ton, then the income change would be that $500. Of course, you'd have to factor in the cost of production, that you've got to buy that seed or you've got to do other things. But the distinction here with the 4 elements that we're asking is, what's the yield without the adaptation of the primary crop, and what's the yield with the adaptation of that primary crop? What's the change in the cost of the system? And is there any other non-yield income changes? And we simply ask that for those 5 types of areas that might be impacted by each production constraint. Now what you're seeing is example data, but when you fill this, you will just fill a line at a time, and you'll only fill for the adaptation that you're talking about at that time. So more will appear as you circle back and add more. If you put 0, then it should then do 0 for the rest of the lines. What we'll mostly find is that in very heavy impact areas, the yield without the adaptation might be close to 0, and often the adaptation won't do anything in those very heavy impact scenarios. The final element then is that level of certainty. The same as always, you've got certain, informed estimate, or high uncertainty. So what we're doing in this module AP is simply relating back the adaptations to our known production constraints that we've done in module P.